theme is Indigenous Female Leadership, Disrupting Dominant Discourses. So today we're going to begin. I want to let you know our drum had vehicle problems, so we're going to go ahead and begin with our color guard. So I'd like to ask people to please rise.
March. Guard. Halt. Left. Face. Freeze it. Arms. Order. Arms. Up, out. Face. Post. Freeze it. Arms. Order. Arms. Ready. Face. Hold. March.
Thank you. You may be seated. Okay, so let me ask one of my colleagues. Hey, Alex Redcorn, would you please present our gifts to the color guard? Okay. Yeah, they're out there. Good morning. Laverne, I'm going to start with my introduction. Laverne Bitsy Baldwin in Shia, Kia Ani in Shlu, Tworich Eatni, Bashichin, Twahachin, New Mexico Dan. That's my formal introduction in Navajo. I told you my name is Laverne Bitsy Baldwin. I'm of the Towering House people and the Bitterwater people, and that I'm from Tohatchi, New Mexico. So that's who I am. What I do is I'm director for the Multicultural Engineering Program at Kansas State University, and I am co-chair for the KSU Indigenous Faculty Staff Alliance. And we welcome you here this morning for our third annual Indigenous Peoples Day Conference. You got a preview there. I want to begin by recognizing that Kansas State University is on the land of the Kaw people, and that the state of Kansas occupies the ancestral lands of the Osage, the Pawnee, and many other tribes who use the Great Plains of western Kansas as their hunting grounds. During the era of removal, many more tribal nations were forcibly moved through Kansas, and at one point called Kansas home. Kansas is the current home of 4 federally recognized tribes: the Kickapoo, Iowa, Prairie Band Potawatomi, and the Sac and Fox nations. So we begin by recognizing that we are always on Indigenous lands. I wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are. The Indigenous Faculty Staff Alliance is K-State's affinity group for Native American, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples. The organization was created in 2015 to address the need to support and growth and greater visibility of Indigenous people, nations, and perspectives on K-State's campus, Kansas, and beyond. This includes incorporating Indigenous knowledges and methodologies into both the academy and campus life. And that's definitely what we're here for today. Given that not only K-State, but also every university is on Indigenous lands, the recognition that America's history begins and continues through Indigenous context is essential. So our mission as the Indigenous faculty and staff is to create decolonized spaces at the university and increase the presence, promotion, and support of Indigenous faculty and staff and students at K-State. And we want to thank our sponsors for helping us to do this. We have the College of Education, the Dean's Office, Department of Educational Leadership, Diversity for Community Service, Social Justice Education, and Graduate Certificate. In the College of Arts and Sciences, the Dean's Office, Department of English, and the Diversity Committee. The Kansas State University LGBT Resource Center. The Dow Center for Multicultural and Community Studies at K-State Libraries. The KSU Multicultural Engineering Program. The Chief Diversity and Inclusion Office. K-State Alumni Association, the Office of Institutional Equity, the Office of Student Life, the Oz to Oz Program, Office of International Programs, the Australian American Fulbright Commission, and the College of Agriculture. This event is being live streamed and recorded for later posting on the Indigenous Alliance website, on the K-State website. So just know that you may be recorded today. And we thank you. So with that, I appreciate all of our sponsors, and I would like to invite our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer to give a K-State welcome, Dr. Brian Samuel.
Thank you all for having me here today. I want to say thanks to my friend Laverne Bixie Bowen and Alex Redcorn for having me here, as well as the Indigenous People Alliance at K-State University. I am Dr. Brian Samuel, the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer here at K-State, and on behalf of President Myers, the President's Cabinets, all our faculty, staff, and students, I want to thank each of you for being here today. And it's really interesting the way things work. I'm going to digress for just a minute. President Myers and I had the distinct pleasure of participating in a national conversation maybe 3 weeks ago. It was September the 20th and 21st at the University of Penn. And during that time, I had the distinct pleasure of being in one of the roundtable conversations with a young lady by the name of Dr. Cassandra Manuelito Kirk-Covlet. And she was, believe it or not, the first ever Native American woman to be a president of a college or university that was not a tribal college. And so today, I'm giving greetings on behalf of the President and the President's Cabinet and the K-State University, and our theme is Indigenous Female Leadership, Disrupting Dominant Discourses. How about that as a coincidence? And one of the things that she shared with me is that she got her post at the University of Seattle or Antioch College, I forget which exactly, but it was somewhere in Seattle, Washington, I think. And that was 2007. So we've had higher education in the United States since the 1800s, in some cases even 1700. And it was 2007 before there was a Native American woman president of a college or university that was not a tribal college. What does that tell us? it says to me that there's a little work yet to be done, I think. And I hope we all can agree with that. I won't take much of your time. I do want to invite all of you whose schedule will permit to help us continue K-State's commitment to diversity and inclusion tomorrow here in this building, the K-State Student Union, as we celebrate the second edition of the KS Unite movement that we started last year. It's an excellent opportunity to further engage with students, faculty, staff, and community members about the diversity continuum. We got a lot of great topics. We're going to have presenters from around our campus, in some cases across the state and even the nation, to talk about things such as first-generation college students and their retention rates and how to work with and serve them. We're going to have some conversations around microaggressions. We're going to have some conversations around free speech. We're going to have a march here to the union, and then a few people will speak, including myself, President Myers, and a keynote by Dr. Bernard Franklin, and then our own Associate Vice President for Diversity and Multicultural Student Affairs is going to lead us in more information about our Multicultural Center that we're working on. So it's going to be a great day, regardless of the rain. And I strongly encourage all of you, and I'm asking if you would please join us. Thank you and have a great day.
Hello, my name is Alex Redcorn, and I'm from the Osage Nation, the Wahakoline district of the Osage Nation, and I'm from the Siji-Washtage people of that nation. And the Wahakoline Nation is basically Pawhuska, Oklahoma, so if anybody's ever been to Pawhuska, then that's home base, all right? But I wanted to I'm also an assistant professor in educational leadership, and I'm a co-chair with Laverne on the Indigenous Faculty Staff Alliance. I also want to welcome everybody to our campus for our third annual Indigenous Peoples Day Conference. What started as a small idea hoping to gather about 30 to 50 individuals 3 years ago has quickly become a much larger event, and we appreciate everyone taking the time to be here today. In the audience today, throughout the day, we should have representation from over 30 tribal nations from several states, and we have people joining us via the live stream from across the nation. This year, our theme, Indigenous Female Leadership, Disrupting Dominant Discourses, is very exciting. During planning, as our Indigenous Faculty Staff Alliance discussed all the potential themes for the conference, and we started putting together potential keynotes, there was a very organic thing that started to happen as all the names that kept rising to the top were Indigenous female leaders. And pretty soon, the theme became self-apparent. And these Indigenous female leaders are doing important work to disrupt dominant discourses, or if you think about the power of colonialism continuing through modern contexts, they're working to push back against that, and they're working to make space for more authentic ways of being, more Indigenous ways of being, and it's very important work. So as the theme emerged out of the discussions, it became clear to me that my role in this event would be to also acknowledge my own personal social reality. As someone who identifies as a heterosexual male, my life experiences and social capital influence how I perceive and interpret the world. And since heterosexual men more often hold positions of power, there are many perspectives that are often unheard or misinterpreted. Therefore, this event is not just about making room for in-depth discussions about and with Indigenous peoples. It is also about acknowledging how conversations about diversity and multiculturalism should not stop at race and ethnicity. With this in mind, we are very fortunate to have the following lineup of speakers. Elizabeth Kronk-Warner from the University of Kansas Law School will be talking about the raping of Indian country. She will be followed by Dr. Menthorn from the University of Mexico, who will be talking about indigenizing the academy and reclaiming the space of our ancestors. Immediately following, we will be providing a lunch for those who registered for the full day. So any students in here that are kind of stopping in and out, stay away from the food. No, that's just, so we will be screening the film Warrior Women, and it's a film about the untold story of the American Indian movement and women behind the scenes of the American Indian movement. We will then have a series of breakout sessions from 1:30 to 2:30 on Native women's leadership, Indigenous food sovereignty, and Indigenous research methodologies. And then we will conclude with a keynote from our Oz to Oz Fulbright visiting scholar on Indigenous data and Indigenous data sovereignty. Immediately following the conference, there's a meeting for the Kansas Association of Native American Educators, and all are welcome to join. So now I would like to invite Tristan Herbst, who is our Native American Student Association president, and let him come to the stage and introduce our first keynote speaker.
Thank you, Alex. So, my name is Tristan Herbst, and I'm a member of the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. I'm a senior studying anthropology, and I'm the president of the Native American Student Association. Sorry, my voice is really raspy. I am pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Elizabeth Kronk-Warner, a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. She is a professor of law, associate dean, academic affairs director, tribal law and government center affiliated professor, Indigenous studies courtesy faculty, and teaches in the environmental studies program at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas. Her scholarship focuses primarily on the intersection of Indian law and environmental law, and is published in several prominent journals, including the Arizona Law Review, Colorado Law Review, and Columbia Journal of Environmental Law. She's also co-author of the casebook Native American Natural Resources, and she co-edited Climate Change and Indigenous People, The Search for Legal Remedies. In addition to teaching, Warner serves as an appellate judge for the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians Court of Appeals in Michigan, and as a district judge for the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation in Kansas. She served as a chairwoman of the Kansas Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. She received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Michigan Law School and a Bachelor of Science from Cornell University. Today, her keynote is titled Raping Indian Country. Please help me welcome Elizabeth Kronk-Warner.
Did you see Tristan's beautiful medallion? It's very nice, thank you. Boshu Anishinaabe, hello friends. My name is Elizabeth Kronk-Warner, and it is an absolute pleasure to be with you for multiple reasons today. So first, it's always a pleasure to come over to Manhattan and this beautiful campus, so thank you for having me. Second, I really appreciate all the work that Dr. Redcorn and the other members of the Faculty Staff Indigenous Alliance have done in bringing together this topic and celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day. So it's really just an honor to be part of this great group. And third, to be honest, as of, I think this is a true statement, September 1st, we had no Indigenous Day planning at the University of Kansas. And I said, look at this program that K-State has put together. Look at this amazing lineup and speakers. And now we have at least 2 events at the University of Kansas. So thank you for being a leader on Indigenous Peoples Day. It is very much appreciated. So today, I'm going to talk to you about a difficult conversation, and I recognize that it may be triggering for some, and so we obviously want to be respectful of our discourse, but I think it's important to talk about the intersection of environmental issues and vulnerable communities within Indian country, and specifically my presentation is titled Raping in Indian Country. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about why I titled the presentation the way I did. Then we'll talk about some of the policies of the current administration that are leading to increased vulnerability within Indian country. Then we're going to talk about how there is this direct connection and what's happening here in the United States with regards to this increased vulnerability. And then I don't want to leave it there, right? I don't want to deconstruct and leave without solutions. So we're going to talk about some of the options that we have to hopefully try to make things a little bit better in Indian country, and I would argue for the United States as a whole. So first, why is this presentation titled Raping Indian Country? So first, I am admittedly using rape as a metaphor, although we'll see how some of the environmental policies are leading to increased vulnerability, which does lead to physical rape. And I want to acknowledge that that is controversial. There are many rape advocates that say if we use rape as a metaphor, that demeans the actual physical violence of rape, and so therefore we should not use it as a metaphor. However, I think that it is appropriate in this context because we're talking about it as both serious harm to the climate and the environment, and serious harm to vulnerable populations within Indian country. And I should say, when I use the term Indian country, I'm using it both as a legal term of art and as a colloquial term. So in the law, when we refer to Indian country, we're referring to reservations, but we're also referring to allotments. So you could have an Indian allotment that is not part of a reservation. It could be many miles away. So for example, there are allotments for tribes in North Dakota and Montana, so it could be hours and hours and hours away. And then also dependent Indian communities. So those are communities where the federal government plays a management role within the community. So it has a legal connotation, but also for many of us working with tribes here in the United States, when we refer to Indian country, we're referring to all Indian communities within the United States, so that could be inclusive of urban communities as well. So when I use that term, it has both colloquial meanings and legal meanings as well. But we're talking about the harm to both the environment and to vulnerable communities within Indian country. And so we see how the two are connected. And there are reasons to use this language of sexual violence when we're talking about what's happening to our environments within Indian country. So many tribal cultures, including my own, talk about the earth and natural resource development as a violent attack upon the environment. You do hear advocates talking about the rape of Mother Earth. And so it does have this violent connotation when we talk about natural resource exploitation within Indian country that's not done in a sustainable and reliable and responsible way. Also, for many of us, and I include myself in that, the earth or the environment does take on feminine qualities. So for example, if you follow the Dakota Access Pipeline controversy that happened in 2016, 2017, and which is still being fought today, there's still legal arguments in the courts, you might have heard this argument, water is life. And so obviously water is physically life, right? We need water to survive, but it's also this feminine quality of water, that water gives us birth, we're connected to water, and so that's a good example of this relationship between the feminine and the environment. And so obviously when we talk about raping Indian country, it then takes on that feminine quality. But also, as we see when we go through the presentation, there is this connection between damage to the environment and the natural resource and exploitation, and then also how many groups within Indian country who were already vulnerable for a wide variety of historical reasons and for historical trauma are now being increasingly more vulnerable and more at risk to sexual assault, to rape, etc. So there is a direct connection, as we'll see throughout this presentation, between the natural resource extraction and development of energy within Indian country, and then actual rape and sexual assault in Indian country. So there is a connection there. So therefore, I believe that the idea of rape unifies both the physical violence that those vulnerable in our communities are experiencing and the physical violence to the natural communities. So that's why I use the term raping Indian country, but I do so with an acknowledgement and being thoughtful about the fact that for many rape advocates, that is concerning. And so if that's anything that anybody wants to talk about more, I'd be happy to have that conversation, but I just want to acknowledge that it's something that I've been thoughtful about. All right, so again, this presentation is going to focus on that connection between increased energy and natural resource development within Indian country and what's happening and how women and children in particular are increasingly vulnerable within Indian country as a result. So first, let's talk a little bit about the federal role in energy and natural resource development in Indian country, because I think it's really helpful to have that as a baseline so we can understand how what's happening at the federal level is impacting Indian country. So first off, before delving into the federal role, I do want to acknowledge and kind of underline, highlight, star that tribal sovereignty persists. So tribal sovereignty remains true today. Tribal sovereignty has never been divested. We've seen every president since President Nixon say that there should be government-to-government relationships between the federal government and tribes. The Supreme Court has uniformly upheld tribal sovereignty, and Congress has upheld tribal sovereignty. So when I talk about the role of the federal government, that's not to say that tribal sovereignty does not exist. It still persists to this day. It's merely to recognize that the federal government does take a large role in Indian country. Now, why is that? So the federal government has had a large role in Indian country since about 1823. There was a Supreme Court decision called Johnson v. McIntosh. We don't need to go into the details other than to say that the result of that decision was that the federal government has a property interest in any land in Indian country. If you've ever wondered, why is it that a lot of our tribes tend to be so poor? It's because tribes do not typically in the United States own their land. So think about it. How do you engage in economic development today? What would you typically do if you're starting a business? You might mortgage your property, right? Take a lien out against your property. If you're working in Indian country, you can't do that because the federal government owns the land. So that started the federal government's role within Indian country starting in 1823, and then that was really expanded by the end of the 19th century when there was another Supreme Court decision, the United States versus Kagama, where the Supreme Court held that the federal government has something called plenary authority in Indian country, which means that Congress, theoretically, could do whatever it wants in Indian country by virtue of this plenary authority. And it's done that in the past. After World War II, we had something called the termination era. If anybody's ever studied Indian policy, you know that this was a time period when the federal government terminated its political relationship with tribes. And so Congress has exercised its plenary authority to the detriment of tribes. It's also done it to benefit tribes. But the reason why Congress can do that is because it has this plenary authority. So because of these 19th century decisions, the federal government plays a very large role in Indian country. And even though tribes are still sovereign, the federal government has this ability to enact legislation that's going to directly impact tribes. So what you have here up on this slide are a list of various federal statutes that directly implicate energy and natural resource development in Indian country. So for example, if you want to do any subsurface mining, so if you want to do coal mining, coal bed methane, platinum, uranium, etc. in Indian country, then you're going to have to comply with the federal standards under the Indian Mineral Leasing Act or the Indian Mineral Development Act in order to engage in that. Similarly, you're probably going to have to be involved in the Rights of Way Act and the Long-Term Leasing Act because you're going to have to get a lease from the federal government, it's approved by the federal government in order to engage in that type of development. Even if you want to do renewable energy development in Indian country, you're still going to have to deal with the federal government. Under the Energy Policy Act, there's specifically an Indian energy title, which says that if a tribe wants to engage in some sort of agreement and not go through the federal government, then the tribe has to enter into a memorandum of understanding with the federal government before it can do so. Similarly, in the Hearth Act is like helping expedite, it's the worst named statute ever, so they just call it the Hearth Act. But basically, it's the same thing, that you have to enter into this memorandum of understanding before the tribe can go ahead and engage in this type of work. The federal government plays a large role in energy development in general. It's not limited to Indian country, and that's why we have the Federal Power Act, the Public Utility Regulatory Practices Act, and the Natural Gas Act. Those are all acts that apply across the United States in general. So the federal government plays a large role in energy and natural resource development, regardless of whether or not we're within Indian country. Further, we have federal environmental statutes, which are considered statutes of general applicability. Olivia over here, who's going to be our environmental lawyer in the future, she's going to be an amazing environmental lawyer in the future. She's going to practice under these. And we've got things such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. These are all statutes that likewise apply across the country and have huge impact. So this is all to say that the federal government plays a really large role when we're talking about energy and natural resource development in Indian country. And so that's why those of us who are advocates in Indian country, we care about what's going on at the federal level and we need to pay attention. So let's talk about this current administration and what the current administration is doing with regards to energy development in Indian country. So the Trump administration in general, you've probably heard President Trump has been very vocal about his desire to develop domestic energy production. So he has stated that that's a goal of the administration in general. And in particular, there's this interest in developing energy development or energy resources within Indian country. And the quote up here talks about some of the availability of energy is in Indian country. So a lot of tribes within the United States, especially in the Midwest and in the West, sit on valuable substrate resources. So we have tribes that sit on top of the largest uranium in the United States, coal production, methane gas, et cetera, within Indian country. But in addition to those traditional energy resources, a lot of our tribes also happen to be located in areas that are highly valuable for renewable energy. So for example, outside of the coast, so we've got a lot of wind development on the coast of the country. So putting the coast to the side, within the United States, if you look at a map of where the largest wind resources are, you'll see that it's where the wind comes over the Rocky Mountains. And if you've been to western Kansas, right, you know that that's true, right? It gets really windy sometimes when you get close, the closer you get to those Rocky Mountains. And so a lot of our tribes are located in that region, are located right over the Rocky Mountain region. And so some of our tribes are sitting on the largest wind resources. Similarly with the largest solar resources. A lot of our tribes in the Southwest, so for example, there's been huge outreach to the Navajo Nation, for example, to develop solar resources there because there's a lot of opportunity. So that's all to say that there is huge opportunity within Indian country to develop these both traditional resources, so resources from the substrate, and then also renewable resources, and the administration has demonstrated its desire to develop and to have energy development within Indian country. And we have two relatively recent examples of that. So President Trump was sworn in as president on Friday. On the Tuesday following his swearing in, he signed two presidential memoranda that called on the Secretary of the Army. So the Army Corps of Engineers is the one who has final permitting authority over pipelines that go across the United States. He calls on the Secretary of the Army to do everything possible under the law to expedite approval of both the Keystone and Dakota Access pipelines. So we know that this is top on his agenda because it's literally one of the first things he does after being sworn in as president. So we know that this administration is focused on energy development. We know that there are energy resources in Indian country, God bless you, and we know that the president is focused on Indian country by evidence of these pipelines that are being approved very shortly after him being confirmed as president. All right, so what else has happened since he became president, or I guess was sworn in as president? So first off, in addition to the presidential memoranda that we just talked about, he's also issued Executive Order 13766, which calls for the expediting of environmental reviews. Remember on the slide earlier, I said that one of the environmental statutes of general applicability is the National Environmental Policy Act. One of the things that the National Environmental Policy Act does, it does not require the most environmentally friendly decision, but it does require that anything that it has substantial interest from the federal government, so not every project, but if there's a substantial federal piece, then you have to review what are the most environmentally friendly options, and you have to consider whether or not you should adopt one of those more environmentally friendly options. Well, this executive order expediting environmental reviews is saying that the federal government should really move that along, that should be fast. Because under the National Environmental Policy Act, it does tend to be time intensive, usually about 6 months to a year, in order to do that environmental assessment and see what are the other options. So this first executive order says, let's move that along, let's make that a shorter period of time. He also issued this Executive Order 13783, promoting energy independence and economic growth. And basically, that's an articulation of his vision for the United States to really develop its local domestic energy resources. So he stated that in that executive order. Also, you may be aware of the fact that President Trump has withdrawn the United States from the climate change Paris Accords. So under President Obama, the United States was participating in the Paris Accords, and the Paris Accords was a coming together of pretty much all the other countries within the world to say that we're going to combat the impacts of climate change. President Obama and the United States has signed on, but then President Trump's concerns was he argues that that would slow development within the United States, and so therefore he withdrew the United States from the climate accords. Also in June 2017, he met with tribal leaders. So he actually met with a handful of tribal leaders in the White House to discuss energy development in Indian country. And again, he explicitly stated his intention to allow for energy development within Indian country and to ease or end some of these regulatory burdens from his perspective that was impacting energy development in Indian country. You might also be aware that there's current litigation pending on the Bears Ears National Monument. At the end of the Obama administration, President Obama set aside land to create the Bears Ears National Monument, which was an area of historical importance for many tribes, 12 tribes within the southwest region. And President Trump removed a portion of land from the National Monument. So the National Monument exists still, but it's much smaller than it was. The land that he removed from the National Monument is land that's rich in energy resources. So it's consistent with his overall policy of promoting energy development. Many tribes, there's current active litigation on that. The argument is the statute which allowed President Obama to put the land aside as a national monument, the Antiquities Act, specifically says that presidents can put land aside as a national monument. It does not speak to whether or not presidents can then take land out of a national monument. It is silent on that. So the litigation is whether or not President Trump had the authority to remove land once it had been designated as a national monument. So we'll continue to follow that. The Navajo Nation is very active in that litigation and is lead on that litigation. And then we've also seen federal agencies really follow suit. The Department of Interior ended the moratorium on federal coal leasing. So under the Obama administration, President Obama put in place a moratorium on any coal development within federal land. So that's been ended. And then also the Department of Interior is currently reviewing policies related to climate change to identify which ones potentially impede development. So overall, we can see that this administration is focused not only on energy development in general, but very much specifically focused on energy development within Indian country. So I said that this presentation is about the intersection between energy and natural resource development and sexual assault and rape. So let's look at it on the other side. So what is this administration doing to protect Native people? That is less clear. We know that the administration is very clearly focused on energy development. We don't know what the administration is doing to protect the lives of Native people from criminal behavior. So you may know that just last week, the Congress, so not this, obviously not the administration, but Congress allowed for the Violence Against Women Act to elapse. So the Violence Against Women Act, as we'll talk about later, was in part helping to protect Native women because it allowed for tribes to prosecute non-Native offenders. So the vast majority of those who commit sexual assault within Indian country are non-Native. It's about 75 to 80% of those who perpetuate that are non-Native. And so the Violence Against Women Act has been ended and those protections are in flux. So that is certainly troubling to those of us working in Indian country. Now, as with energy and natural resource development, the federal government plays a large role in terms of crime within Indian country. So first off, there was the Major Crimes Act from the 19th century. And what the Major Crimes Act does is it says that the federal government has jurisdiction over major crimes that are committed in Indian country. So these are things like rape, kidnapping, homicide, burglary, etc. If you commit one of these crimes in Indian country, you can be prosecuted by the federal government. Now, tribes still have the ability to prosecute you, but That brings in the Indian Civil Rights Act. So the Indian Civil Rights Act was a rider to the 1968 Civil Rights Act. And what the Indian Civil Rights Act does is it applies the majority of the protections of the Bill of Rights to Indian countries. So prior to the Indian Civil Rights Act, the Bill of Rights did not apply in Indian country. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that. The separation of church and state does not apply to Indian country because we do have theocracies. So, for example, many of our pueblos are theocracies. Also, you don't have a right to an attorney in Indian country. So there are some exceptions. But another thing that the Indian Civil Rights Act does is it limits the punishment authority of a tribe to 1 year and/or a $5,000 fine. So if I want to commit a rape, where am I going to commit a rape? Where am I going to go? I'm probably, and criminals are sophisticated. They're thinking of this. We have rapists in Oklahoma that are taking Native women and driving them around so they cannot say where they were raped. So this Indian Civil Rights Act created a huge hole in terms of effective enforcement by basically handcuffing the ability of tribes to respond to those crimes effectively. Because again, if you're thinking of killing somebody, or if you're thinking of raping somebody or kidnapping somebody, and you're looking around, you're saying, well, if I commit it here in Kansas, I'm going to jail for a long time, versus if I commit the crime here in Indian country, if I'm convicted, it's only a year. So criminals are smart. They're targeting Indian country for that reason. Then you add on the United States Supreme Court's decision in Oliphant versus Suquamish Indian Tribes from 1978, and it's just a home run for criminals. Because what Oliphant does is Oliphant says that tribes no longer have jurisdiction over non-Indians. So now, if you're a non-Indian, and especially if you're non-Indian thinking about sexual assault or rape, the only one who can prosecute you if you commit a rape or sexual assault in Indian country is, any ideas? It's the federal government, right, thank you. And the federal government, if you have to go and investigate a rape, time is of the essence. You need to do a rape kit, you need to get on the ground, you need to find out what's happening, and the FBI and the federal marshals are the ones who are responsible for those investigations. How far away are they? They're usually not where the tribes are located, right? So when I lived in Montana, the FBI and marshal's office was located in Billings, and that was up to 12 hours away from some tribes. So even if you have federal officers who jump in their car and immediately go to investigate, which they don't jump in their car and immediately go to investigate, but even if they did, you're still looking at hours of delay, which if you're a prosecutor and then you're looking at this case, let's say they even are considering taking the case, do you think that federal prosecutor is going to take data that even if it was collected is days old? So now you're starting to see some of the difficulty with prosecuting crime in Indian country and why Indian country is specifically targeted for these types of crimes. So there's this stereotype of Indian country being a lawless place. And effective punishment of crime is a challenge in Indian country. But it's not a challenge because we're Indians and we're inherently inferior and we're lawless people. It's a challenge because we have these layers of federal laws that have been put upon us and really make effective enforcement difficult. So that all happened before the Trump administration. So the Trump administration is not responsible of that. But the result is that we have these horrifying statistics. And in 2016, we got this report that concluded only 90% of Native people report that they have been victims of interracial violence. That is a victim of a non-Indian predator. So for every 10 Native people who are in this room, 9 of us have been victims of some sort of assault. I myself am a survivor of sexual assault. That is a horrifying statistic when you think about it, and when you're working in Indian country, that 90% of the people. And the rape statistics are 1 in 2 Native women. And many people, many advocates tell me that they think that that is underreported, that that is a conservative. So think about that the next time you're talking to 2 Native women. Statistically, one of the people you're talking to has been raped, and potentially both of them have. That is horrifying, absolutely horrifying. So we got this report saying that the numbers as of 2016 are incredibly horrific, and especially that women in Indian country are more likely to experience this crime. Now, I am going to focus on women and children, but I do want, as a caveat, to say that sexual assault and rape is not a woman's problem. 1 in 8 white heterosexual men, so that's dominant men, are raped or sexually assaulted in their lifetime. 1 in 8. And if you're a transgendered man or if you are a homosexual man, that number greatly increases. So I think sometimes we think about this as a problem that impacts women. This is not a woman's problem. This is everybody's challenge that we all need to deal with. So I am going to talk about women because our statistics focus on women, but I do want to acknowledge that this is not something that is limited to women. Our men are experiencing this as well. All right, so under President Obama, we got 2 things to try to help address this situation. So we got the Tribal Law and Order Act in 2010. And a notable part, what the Tribal Law and Order Act does, is the Tribal Law and Order Act is a slight fix to that Indian Civil Rights Act because it allows for tribes to punish up to 3 years and or a $15,000 fine, and you can, what's called stack, so you can add those up to 9 years. So a little bit more effective in terms of having tools to deal with these crimes that we're facing in Indian country, because now under the Tribal Law and Order Act, if we have multiple crimes, so and typically if you have engaged in a sexual assault, then you also probably have a battery, maybe you have a kidnapping, so you probably do have other crimes that have been committed. You could stack those crimes and potentially put somebody away for up to 9 years and potentially fine them for $45,000. So a little bit more of an effective tool in order to comply with that. And then also under President Obama, we got the Violence Against Women Act of 2013, which did many things, but specific to Indian country, what it did is it allows for tribes to prosecute non-Indian offenders, because remember, after the Oliphant decision, we don't have jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit crimes in Indian country, allows for tribes to prosecute non-Indian offenders who have committed intimate partner violence. And the reason why I emphasize intimate partner is in order for the tribe to have jurisdiction over you, we have to have had an intimate partner relationship. So we either have to have had dated, currently be dating or dated in the past, or we have to be married. And moreover, that person has to have a connection to the tribe. And so I'm very happy for it. It was a positive step forward. But as we'll see, first of all, it's expired. So as of last week, Congress did not renew it, so it's expired. So it's put that jurisdiction into risk. Secondly, as we'll see when we talk about this natural resource development that's happening in Indian country, it's not going to be an effective tool because we oftentimes don't have that intimate partner connection. Because we're talking about people who are coming to the communities who are transient and they're not establishing a relationship with the tribe. Now, unfortunately, the Department of Justice reported that the Obama administration did not do a great job of implementing the Tribal Law and Order Act nor the Violence Against Women Act. And so here you have the quote demonstrating, again, this report was released in 2017, but it was based on the Obama administration's implementation, and it ultimately concluded that there's a lot of work to be done. Now, the reason why that's relevant to the Trump administration is because we're still waiting to see what the Trump administration is going to do with this report. So far, the Trump administration has not taken any steps to address the concerns that were released in this report. And so that's why I say that it's still a little ambiguous as to what the president is going to do to help increase and reduce the vulnerability of Native women. So we're at this crossroads. We don't know what the Trump administration is going to do. It is concerning. It certainly signals the fact that the Violence Against Women Act expired, that the administration is not going to work to protect Native women and children. Also, the administration has yet to work on that the 2017 report that was based on the Obama administration up to 2016. So we have some things that signal the administration is not going to focus on this, but it's not entirely clear, and I'm hopeful that there's always a chance that the administration will work on these issues. All right, so how do these two intersect? We've talked about the federal role in energy development and natural resource development, and we've talked about the federal government's role in trying to keep Native and women and children safe, or in the case that we've seen, how the federal policies are making Native women and children more vulnerable. So these intersect in a couple of different ways. So first off, because of increased energy and natural resource development, there is a direct linkage to climate change. Such development leads to increased greenhouse gases, which then leads to climate change. We're seeing that here in Kansas. So many of our tribes are on the Iguala Aquifer. Those of you who have worked on the Iguala Aquifer know that it's not homogeneous, it is heterogeneous. And so some tribes, such as Prairie Band, are fine on their water resources. Other tribes who are just up the road, such as the Kickapoo tribe, are having extreme water problems and have run out of water in summer because of the drought. And that's because the portion of the aquifer that they're on is not deep. And because of the drought, because of the extreme heat that we've experienced, they're having water problems. So we've seen it here in Kansas ourselves. Why are tribes more vulnerable to climate change than the rest of us? There are two reasons why. So first off, there's a legal reason and then there's a cultural reason. So from the legal perspective, a lot of tribes' legal rights, especially their usufructuary rights, their hunting and fishing rights, are tied to a certain area. So my tribe, we have fishing rights that we've negotiated with the state of Michigan. If the tribe decides to get up and leave and go to Canada because it's a little cooler and that's what we're used to, those hunting and fishing rights aren't coming with us, right? They're legally tied to a specific area. Similarly, for a lot of us, and I can speak about myself, we're tied to specific areas of land because it has cultural and spiritual significance. So unlike somebody who's Christian or Jewish or Muslim who could go to a church or a synagogue and mosque and participate in their faith, for me, I have to go home. I have to go back to my reservation in order to participate in my summer ceremonies. It's not something that I can do wherever I'm at. So therefore, the place, the very specific place, takes on these cultural and spiritual connections as well. So that's going to make it much more difficult for me to leave and find new land. So unlike people outside of Indian country who, if it gets too hot, or if you lose your water, or if species you rely on for hunting leave, you could theoretically leave and follow them as well. It's much more difficult for us in Indian country, and as a result, that makes us particularly vulnerable to climate change because we don't have the freedom to come and go without these consequences that other populations do. And we are experiencing climate change. Southwest is being specifically very hard hit. We're seeing desertification in many places in Southwest. I mentioned how here in Kansas we're being negatively impacted because of those water rights. We're seeing shifting vegetation and animal ranges, and that impacts many of our indigenous peoples here in the United States who may rely on hunting and fishing rights for subsistence purposes. For example, in Alaska, the caribou are moving further and further north, and so the hunters who would rely on the caribou for subsistence purposes, they can't move further and further north because their usufructuary, their hunting and fishing rights are tied to a very specific area. We're seeing losses of species. We're seeing, for example, salmon, and the Pacific Northwest tribes who rely on the salmon are having huge impacts to their culture and their loss of salmon. Also, one thing that we sometimes don't think about is the fact that we have climate change refugees in the United States today, and they're indigenous peoples. So we have lost land in Louisiana. The Isle de Saint Charles in Louisiana are an indigenous peoples who lived in the Gulf region since time immemorial, and because of erosion, their land is gone. So where do you go if you're an indigenous peoples and you've lost your land? They're dealing with that right now. They've literally lost their land because of erosion and flooding. Similarly, in Alaska, along the coast, where 75% of our indigenous peoples are, in Alaska, we've seen huge erosion. We see erosion on the level of 3 feet per year. And do I have any environmental scientists out there? You know, 3 feet per year? Usually you're talking about 3 feet per century, maybe, but per year, it's because of the incredibly intensifying storms. So we already have climate change refugees in the United States, and they're indigenous peoples. And so this is directly impacting us. So we see that connection between energy development and natural resource extraction and what's happening in Indian country. Another challenge that's impacting us in Indian country are something that we call man camps. And the reason why we call them man camps is because these tend to be large, temporary infrastructures of largely men who are transient and who are doing energy development and natural resource work. And so that's why they're called man camps, because they tend to be temporary in nature and they tend to pop up wherever there's energy and natural resource extraction work to be done. So for example, where there's a pipeline, you might see a man camp pop up to finish the pipeline. And we have incredibly troubling statistics that have come up as a result on these man camps. And I'll just draw your attention to that last sentence that says, on some reservations, Indigenous women are murdered at a rate of 10 times the national average. We have over 3,000 missing Indigenous women within the United States that we don't know what's happened to them. So that's just the statistic based on the women that we do know what's happened to them. There are 3,000 right now, 3,000 plus, that we don't know what has happened to them. So the statistics are incredibly troubling. So what are these man camps? When energy companies seek to do this natural resource extraction, they have to attract this large number of temporary workers. A lot of this natural resource extraction is happening, if it's not in Indian country, it's happening right near Indian country. So the Dakota Access Pipeline controversy is a great example of that. The Dakota Access Pipeline is actually not within the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's territory, not its current territory, it's within its traditional territory. But it's 0.5 miles, so half a mile north of the tribe. So who's going to be impacted? It's going to be the Standing Rock tribe. Now what's deeply troubling about that is the pipeline was supposed to go 10 miles outside of Bismarck, which is an overwhelmingly non-diverse, 90% non-diverse population. It was moved to Standing Rock, which is an overwhelming diverse population. So that's problematic, but it's a good example of it. We see that natural resource extraction leads to increased crime. In the last 15 years, there's been significant increased number in Indian country. So a good example of this is the Bakken oil boom, which happened on North Dakota, right near the western border of North Dakota. And we saw that the number of assault cases in North Dakota, so that's not even specific to Indian country, but in North Dakota increased 82%. 82%. Oh my goodness. And that's not a stress just on Indian country, that's a stress on the state too. Because now you've got a state with a dramatic uptick in sexual assault that has to respond to that and probably doesn't have the resources to respond, not to mention how the tribes are going to respond to that. So we've seen these huge upticks. Also, we know that there's ample anecdotal evidence. A lot of advocates who are doing this important work say there's a lot of people who found themselves victims of sexual assault and rape, and for a wide variety of reasons are not comfortable coming forward. And so those advocates are telling us that the number is actually a lot larger, and people just aren't reporting. Also, we've seen marked increases in sexual assault because of these arrival of man camps, and they do tend to be overwhelmingly non-native, again, because these are transient workers who are coming into the community. And so you have an example here of a tribal police officer who described some of what happened to the child victims. So it's not just adult women, it's also children who are being victimized. This young teenager was forced into sex slavery. We hear stories of Native women and children who are put on freighters, who are in Lake Superior, who are transporting oil back and forth, coal back and forth, ore back and forth, and they're locked up on the freighter and they are taken sexually advantage of the entire time that they're on the freighter. So that's happening to Indigenous peoples. Again, very troubling connection. We already know that Native women and children are at high risk for becoming victims of human trafficking. That's because if you are food insecure, if you tend to be poorer, your rate of being trafficked, your likelihood for being trafficked dramatically goes up. And so therefore, we already know that Indigenous peoples are at high risk, and so when you add the overlay of man camps, that percentage skyrockets. Same is true for prostitution. We're seeing increased rates of prostitution, and once you're engaged in prostitution, or if you're being sex trafficked, your likelihood of them being murdered astronomically increases. So again, we're seeing high rates of murder, not just sexual assault and rape. The federal government is not unaware of this problem. The federal government has acknowledged the problem. In 2013, the Department of Justice acknowledged that there is this relationship between energy extraction and increased vulnerability of Native women and children. And you have here a quote from that report. And the United States attorneys and federal prosecutors are responsible for crime control. I will say one thing that we have that's wonderful here in the state of Kansas is our U.S. attorney, Steve McAllister, also happens to work on the ALI reporter on Indian law, so he's familiar with these issues. He is aware of Indian law, and so I'm pleased to have Attorney General McAllister here in Kansas. So the federal government is aware of these issues. But they've been ineffective, right? Because we have all of these problems with the criminal justice scheme that we were talking about later, which really impede effective justice. And then you lay over that, tribes are trying to deal with this as well. But remember, tribes, first of all, don't have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians unless there's what? Do you remember? Unless there's a relationship, intimate partner. Are the majority of the people who are coming in on these man camps going to have an intimate partner relationship with somebody in the tribe? No, because they're transient, right? They're only there for a certain period of time. So as a result, even though VAWA definitely is a step in the right direction, and I appreciate it, it's not going to help us with this situation because the vast majority of these crimes are not happening between people who have a connection. Moreover, even if the tribe could establish jurisdiction, a lot of the man camps are actually physically located outside of Indian country. So that's going to impede the ability of the tribe to assert jurisdiction because a lot of these camps are outside of their territory. And so therefore, it's going to fall on the state to do a lot of this investigation. And let's go back to our example of North Dakota. North Dakota itself, even assuming that the state is interested in investigating, North Dakota is a great example. North Dakota, sexual assault's gone up 82%, so the state itself is struggling with effective enforcement because they may not have the financial or human resources to address these issues adequately. So as a result, we can see why, some people have called this an epidemic, but we can see why we have these incredibly horrific statistics coming out of Indian country. It's this horrible combination of increased energy development meets problematic criminal jurisdiction, meets the inability, the hand-tying of tribes to adequately address these issues. All right, so what can we do? So the first is get out and vote, right? Vote for people who are aware of these issues, who are motivated, and are going to work to address the issues. That is always an option that we have. Also, another option is tribal empowerment. So we have seen that tribes are capable and able, and in some instances do a better job than the federal government in addressing these issues. So a really good example is under Public Law 638. And some of you who worked in Indian country might have heard of 638 contracts. But basically 638 contracts are contracts which allow for tribes to undertake federal responsibility if they can demonstrate the capacity to do so, and then take on that programming. So here you have an example of how tribes have done a really great job at forest management, actually a better job than the federal government at forest management under these 638 contracts. There's examples in healthcare, in wildlife care, in business development. I could give you many examples of instances where tribes have done a great job. So we can increasingly give this work to tribes because tribes have demonstrated capacity in being successful. And some of that recent legislation that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation signals that Congress may be willing to allow for tribes to take on increased responsibility. So the Violence Against Women Act that we talked about, again, not by no means a perfect solution because it requires that intimate partner connection, is a move towards allowing tribes to prosecute non-natives, and tribes have been doing a great job with it. We haven't gotten any appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, so that definitely signals that tribes are doing a good job. Also, the Energy Policy Act and the Hearth Act, which I mentioned earlier, remember, allows for the federal government to enter into a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement with a tribe, and then once that's in place, then the tribe can go ahead and do it itself. The federal government doesn't have to be involved. So we've gotten some signals from Congress that maybe Congress is willing to allow for tribes to take increased responsibility by themselves. Oh, excuse me. Also, we can reform our criminal justice system to better address these problems through a comprehensive congressional fix, so you can always talk to your congressional representatives about that. So we can have a complete repudiation of Oliphant, allow for tribes to prosecute non-Indians just like they did pre to 1978. So prior to 1978, tribes were doing this. So tribes can go back to doing it. And there's support for that. So the National Congress of American Indians released a study which demonstrated that tribes had the capacity, and that it's likely that a lot of these criminal matters would be better addressed by tribes. So we definitely have that support as well. So I don't want to suggest that there's no hope. There is hope, but this is certainly, this connection between energy development and natural resource development is something that I encourage you to remain seized about and focused on. And to be thoughtful about how you can disrupt that discourse, right? That's the focus of our symposium here today, how you have the capacity and you have the ability to really make a difference and to shine a spotlight on this important issue. And if you'd like some additional resources that you'd want to focus on, here are some great places that you can go to. You can learn more. All of these groups would love to hear from you. For the students in the room, this is a great opportunity to reach out, to volunteer, to do some advocacy work, to do some research. They would love to hear from you. For the adults in the group, if you've got some extra money, I'm sure they would love to take a donation. But there are ways that you can help, and these are organizations that you can help. And if anybody would like a copy of this PowerPoint, you can contact either me or Dr. Redcorn has a copy of the PowerPoint as well. I'll put up my contact information here. And with that, Che Miigwech, I appreciate your time and thank you for coming.
Thank you for your presentation, Elizabeth. We'd like to give you a tobacco tie and a cedar box on behalf of the Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming out.
All right, everybody, we'll regroup for Dr. Menthorn's keynote at about 10:30. All right, so please try to be back in your seats by 10:30, and if you can avoid the tables over there and sit over here, that would be appreciated as well. But we also have a large crowd. field of educational leadership, but there are only a handful of scholars working at the intersection of educational leadership and Indigenous studies. Today, we are lucky enough to have one of the leading scholars in this line of work, and she's been really busy over the last few years, working really hard, and her publications and her work is becoming more visible, and it makes room for people like me. But Dr. Robin Minthorn works tirelessly to make sure that there is space in our educational systems for Indigenous peoples and perspectives. As an associate professor at the University of New Mexico, she works with Native American educational leadership doctoral students, and her research aims to build understanding of Indigenous leadership in higher education, intergenerational Indigenous leadership perspectives, and Native college student experiences. And from what I understand, she's also in the works, has some work centering around motherhood and Indigenous motherhood. Dr. Minthorn has also held leadership positions within several national organizations, including the National Indian Education Association and the American Educational Research Association, among others. She has co-edited 2 books, Indigenous Leadership in Higher Education and Reclaiming Indigenous Research in Higher Education. Throughout all this work, however, there's a common theme. Dr. Minthorn is adamant about making space for Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of being in our education systems. So with that in mind, and knowing that what my elders have taught me, I also find it is important to not only read off her scholarly accomplishments, but to also express my personal appreciation for all the labor, both visible and invisible, that she has put into her work. This is important because her work has made space for some of us here at K-State to engage in similar scholarship, and for all of us to be standing here today at an event like this. So as I invite her up to the stage to speak, I want to thank her for that and show my appreciation. And I want to acknowledge that her work is making it possible for other Indigenous scholars and educators to thrive by making stronger connections between their identities as Indigenous peoples and their work in education. So Dr. Minthorn, thank you for your work, and I invite you to the stage, and everybody join me in welcoming Dr. Minthorn.
Dang, Alex is going to make me cry before I get up here. So Hatsa Robin Minthorn Imka. My name is Robin Zeptahola Minthorn. So I've been intentional about reclaiming and utilizing my Kiowa name, which is Zeptahola, which means six with bow. And it was actually my great-grandmother's Kiowa name, and it means it's a warrior name. And that's something that we do in our tribe is traditionally our Kiowa names are connected to war. And so that's my name, and so I want to also acknowledge that. So first, before we begin, I do want to do another land acknowledgement. Kansas State is on the ancestral lands of the Kansas Kaw people, and Kansas is the home of 4 tribal nations, the Iowa, Kickapoo, Prairie Band, Potawatomi, and Sac and Fox. I also want to acknowledge there have also been displaced Indigenous peoples, such as the Nimipu peoples, otherwise known as the Nez Perce and Leavenworth, whose history of dispossession are tied to this land. I also want to mention that I am also a direct descendant of the Nimipu who were displaced, and so I have a heart connection to that dispossession as well. I am humble and honored to be here today to stand and work in relationship on these lands. So just to provide a little bit of context, I won't talk too much about this because Alex talked a little bit, but I also want to acknowledge my family who is sacrificing for me to be here. So my husband is at home on Indigenous Peoples Day taking care of our daughter, Roxy. And so I want to acknowledge both Gabe and Roxy for allowing me to be here today to be away from them. So I want to acknowledge that as well. So as Alex mentioned, I'm an enrolled citizen of the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma. I'm also a descendant of the Nez Perce, Umatilla, Apache, and Assiniboine tribes. And yes, my parents met at Haskell, so hence the multiple tribes from different places. So I want to acknowledge that too. I was born in Oregon, Pendleton, Oregon, and I grew up in the Lawton, Oklahoma area. Alex mentioned the organizations that I've been a part of, so you can see what organizations I've been a part of. I've tried to work very systematically as a student affairs professional, working with Native college students, and now as a faculty member, trying to decolonize and indigenize spaces in the academy and in higher education, because that's really important. So one of the things I want to also do is start off with acknowledging historical forms and approaches in education. So as told, we would have various different types of people, different knowledge of what Indigenous education is, and also the academy. So I want to also start off with the historical approach. So for those of you who are familiar or are just now learning about the colonial school era, this is a picture of pupils at Carlisle Indian Industrial School. So this was the first boarding school that was established by the federal government to assimilate Native American children and communities, and therefore communities. And so I want to acknowledge this. And this picture is powerful. So if you think about all of us as Indigenous peoples who are sitting here today, all of us have been impacted in some form or manner by boarding school, whether it was our grandparents, our aunts, our mothers, our fathers. They were impacted by boarding schools. So this is powerful because the government has systematically tried to assimilate us and also take away our communities and our knowledge and our culture and our language. So I want to acknowledge this, but also that we have persevered past that. Other historical eras of higher education, there's 3 eras that are recognized, which is the colonial era, 1568 to 1870. This was evangelical control. So this is where Indian missions were in the colonial colleges, and we'll revisit that here in a second. And then 1870 to 1964 is federal or U.S. government control. So Native higher education was ignored except for through tribes and private efforts. And then in 1964 to present, self-determination or Indian control took place, and that was when the formations of tribal colleges and universities began. So for those of you who are familiar with Ivy League colleges and all of the prestige that they may have in regards to their reputation, many people may not be aware that they also had in educating Indian youth and also attempted genocide of their own knowledge to be able to educate them. So they utilized Native youth to be able to advance who they were within their institutional status. And so if we look at Harvard College in 1650, it says the purposes of Harvard College are the advancement of all good literature, arts, and sciences, the advancement of education of youth in all manners of good literature, arts, and sciences, all other necessary provisions that may conduce to education of the English and Indian youth of this country, and knowledge and godliness. Dartmouth in 1769 said Dartmouth College would exist for the education and instruction of youths of Indian tribes in this land in reading, writing, and all parts of learning which shall appear necessary and expedient for civilizing and Christianizing children of pagans, as well as in all liberal arts and sciences, and also of English youth and any others. So it's really important to acknowledge these missions that were established in Ivy Leagues, right? So when we think about higher education, we're also having to call them to be accountable, and how are they continuing to work to advance higher education for Native students. And so over the last 20 years, Dartmouth and Harvard has had more established in the Harvard University Native American program. Dartmouth also has tried to be a little bit more intentional, providing tuition waivers for Native American students. So there has been some accountability of their original founding and mission, but it's taken a long time to get to that point. As you can see, these are some of the first established institutions of higher education, and this is, again, how Native people have been associated with higher ed. So when we start to acknowledge current trends in Native higher education, I just want to give you a profile of Indigenous peoples. In 2014, there were 0.1 million Indigenous students enrolled of the 17.3 million undergraduate students overall. So I'm going to read that again. In 2014, there were 0.1 million Indigenous students enrolled of the 17.3 million undergraduate students overall. So this is how many Native American students are in higher education as of 2014. In 2014, the 6-year graduation rate for full-time Indigenous students was at 41%. So one of the things that to keep in consideration, we look about the statistical reporting of data, which we'll get a little talk about that later on, is how it's reported. So we know some of the trends of our Native students in higher education is that sometimes they stop out, sometimes they take a break because of family issues or family priorities or other things. Sometimes they choose to go to another institution, so the tracking of students is not developed. And so whenever we look at our statistical rates of transfer and graduation rates, it's often skewed, right? Because we're not tracking the student themselves, we're only tracking institutional data. So that's something also to look and be aware of. And then in 2011 to 2012, 85% of Indigenous students were on full financial aid. So only 85% of Indigenous students receive financial aid. So there's a myth out there, and some of you or most of you may have heard this, that all Native Americans go to college for free, right? We know that's not true. I'm one that has student loans, so I can attest that I didn't go to college for free. And so we know that that's not true. There are scholarships, there are some alternatives to be able to have some subsidies and be able to have some support in your higher ed, but it doesn't automatically happen. And then in all 3 years, in 2000, 2010, and 2016, the percentage of post-baccalaureate students who were American Indian or Alaska Native were less than 1%. I would have meant to say less than 1%. So in all 3 years, our statistics across all 3 years that are presented here, our statistics never changed. We never went above 1% in post-baccalaureate numbers. So that means graduate students, doctoral students, master's students, professional students, students in law school, medical school. We never hit above 1% in our statistics. And then in 2015, 0.3% Indigenous faculty so we make up less than 1% of the amount of full-time faculty nationally. So 0.3%, so that's less than half a percentage, right, of full-time faculty who are Indigenous. So when you see Dr. Redcorn, Dr. Levitt, and other faculty, they're a really small group of people who are representing Native faculty in higher education. So it's really important to acknowledge that. So I want to also touch on current topics in Indigenous higher ed. So Indigenous students are invisible in higher education. So if you think about the statistical reporting, the data reports of your institutions, and I'm not sure exactly how Kansas State reports Indigenous students, how are we reported? Are we reported just as anomaly as Native American, American Indian? Are we reported by tribal nations and political affiliations? Are we reported by our nation status? Most institutions don't report by that. We also look at the evolving identity of Indigenous students in a new era. So if we think about the complexity of all of our individual students is that they have multiracial backgrounds, their sexual orientation, the gender identity. And so how we look at that and understand the complexity of our Indigenous students. And then now that there's a new governmental coding for self-identifying our identity, it's increasing the complexity and confusion for college campuses. So before I became a faculty member, I worked at Oklahoma State University, and that's when multiracial was allowed to, students could identify more than one race. So when we were reporting our information on Native American students, it made it more difficult on how we accurately depict the picture of how many Native students are on campus. And so again, that complexity adds to some of the topics around higher education. And then we look at persistence and graduation rates of Indigenous students in college. Again, 41% are being reported. And then recruiting and retaining Native professionals to the higher ed field. We need more Native professionals who are in student affairs and higher education. And then also incorporating Aboriginal, International, Indigenous perspectives. We need to make sure that we're not only focusing on our home communities and our tribes, but also making sure we're connecting the lens across international perspectives, looking in South America, looking in Canada, looking in Australia, New Zealand, Aotearoa. We need to make sure that we're also acknowledging that and seeing the relationships and the connections. Serving Native veterans and Indigenous non-traditional students. So again, how are we serving and acknowledging Native veterans? How are we also serving non-traditional students? So when we talk about non-traditional students in higher education, we're talking about adult students who may be coming in later on after they're not the 18 to 25 or 18 to 22 range. And then also calling on universities to remove mascots, racist symbolism, and indigenizing or decolonizing their spaces. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. I also want to acknowledge the tribal colleges and universities. There are over 35 plus tribal colleges and universities in the United States. So this is a map from the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, and it acknowledges the different tribal colleges, even in Alaska, to the Northern Plains, Northwest, California, and then also the Southwest. So it's important to acknowledge that tribal colleges, tribal nations, are starting to identify and define what Indigenous education looks like for them, what are the needs in their communities, and then how do we respond to those needs, and how do we get community members to come in and pursue higher education and to address those needs. So now I'm just going to touch briefly on this, acknowledging Indigenous knowledge, research, methodologies, and theories, because again, this is important, right? When we talk about research, we talk about things that are important to our communities. We also need to acknowledge our own Indigenous epistemologies and ways of being. So I'm just going to share 3 quotes from 3 scholars, and again, I'll share this with Dr. Redcorn so that if you want a copy of this to see the resources, you can look at that as well. So in-depth Indigenous research conducted with this understanding may allow for the younger generations to greater appreciate the dire conditions experienced by our ancestors. This understanding is not only vital in terms of accuracy, but also in terms of how present generations deal with the shame and guilt that comes with being a colonized people. Further understanding of this kind can only enhance how we move forward into the future. This is from Linda T.U.S. Smith, and she has decolonizing methodologies. So if you're not familiar with that book, I suggest you definitely look into it, especially if you're looking at doing research. Indigenous perspectives offer alternatives, beginning with the restoration of a regime of respect. This ideal contrasts with the status solution. True Indigenous formulations are non-intrusive and build frameworks of respectful coexistence by acknowledging the integrity and autonomy of the various constituent elements of the relationship. So Taiki Alfred. And then the Indigenous knowledge and research paradigm is grounded in the belief that when Indigenous or Native American researchers are a part of the research, the element of the non-researcher as outsider is removed, allowing inherent Native knowledge, values, and lived experiences to strengthen the research and to be seen through Indigenous eyes. Part of the supposition is that the research is not being conducted on people or participants, but with participants. So the components of Indigenous research paradigm are conceptualized as a circle. Each piece is interconnected and does not have more importance than the other. And so I wanted to make sure that we acknowledge this because when we think about research in Indigenous communities historically, there has been, research has been used to hold something against Indigenous communities that have appropriated Indigenous communities, and there have been testing on Indigenous communities, so it has impacted them in various ways. So if you're thinking about or considering doing research with an Indigenous community, it's really important to understand that. But then also, how do we do something respectfully as an Indigenous scholar, Indigenous student, and as a non-Indigenous person, how do you do that even more so understanding the context of that community, building relationships that are authentic and making it reciprocal. So I also want to highlight Indigenous theories via the tribal critical race theory. So how many of you guys have heard of this? Brian Brayboy? All right, okay, good. So I want to just cover the 9 tenets of tribal critical race theory. So it's really important. Dr. Brayboy created this theory because there's critical race theory, which utilizes race as endemic to society. But we also know as tribal nations, we're not only a race, we are a tribal nation. We have a nation-to-nation status with the government, and so we need to acknowledge that. And so this is in a form and a way of acknowledging that. And so the first tenet is colonization is endemic to society. So colonization pervades everything that is happening here today in America, right? America is founded on colonization, and we need to remember that. So when we talk about the disappointments of what's happening today, it's no surprise to Indigenous peoples. We've experienced it firsthand on a daily basis. U.S. policies towards Indigenous peoples are rooted in imperialism, white supremacy, and a desire for material gain. So again, thinking about the U.S. policies that Dr. Elizabeth Warner was talking about, those are all within the structures of white supremacy and imperialism, right? Those are created on those structures. Indigenous peoples occupy a liminal space that accounts for both the political and racialized nature of our identities. And number 4, Indigenous peoples have a desire to obtain and forge tribal sovereignty, tribal autonomy, self-determination, and self-identification. So again, we are working towards tribal sovereignty. We are sovereign people. We have a nation-to-nation status with the government. The concepts of culture, knowledge, and power take on new meaning when examined through an Indigenous lens. And then 6, governmental policies and educational policies towards Indigenous peoples are intimately linked around the problematic goal of assimilation. So again, with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School photo, that was a part of the U.S. policy, right? And so that was a part of the assimilation efforts of the U.S. government for Indigenous peoples here in the United States. Tribal policies, beliefs, customs, traditions, and visions for the future are central to understanding the lived realities of Indigenous peoples, but they also illustrate the differences in adaptability among individuals and groups. So our knowledge is not static, right? It's always evolving as Indigenous peoples. We've had to be adaptable so that we can continue to exist, and so that's really important to understand that. Stories are not separate from theory. They make up theory and are therefore real, legitimate sources of data and ways of being. So many of us have creation stories. Many of us have stories of maybe a trickster that taught us lessons, right? Or maybe stories of other things. And those are just as legitimate as a statistical data that's showing us how things are to be that way, right? There's both ways of being, and we acknowledge both of them. Theory and practice are connected in deep and explicit ways such that scholars must work towards social change. So again, a part of what he's saying is that what we're doing as Indigenous scholars, as Indigenous peoples, when we're looking at it through a tribal critical race theory, we're doing it through our heart, and it's deeper than just throwing out a theory. It's deeper in the work that we do on a daily basis, because we're trying to promote social change. So Indigenous knowledge remembered. Thank you, sorry. So one of the things I want to also acknowledge is that Indigenous knowledge and methodologies provides the validity through Western standards of research and knowledge that's still imposed on us as Indigenous scholars and students, right? So sometimes we're forced to utilize a theory that doesn't fit our communities. And so this is why these theories and methodologies are created, because this is more adaptable and relevant to our communities. And then Indigenous methodologies and theories provide a platform for us to proactively address educational and social needs within our tribal and Native communities. And I also want to add, don't forget to cite your elders, leaders, and community in your research and your writing. And I take that from Dr. Cornell P.V. Wardy, who always says that and always mentions that. So I really want to acknowledge that, because we don't have to ask for permission to cite our elders or community or tribal leaders. We should be doing that on a daily basis in our work and what we're doing, because that's a part of our thought process and how we function as Indigenous peoples. Only we can carry on their stories and their teachings. Okay, so ways to decolonize higher ed in a new era. So this is the example part. I just wanted to give you some context and foundation. So, sorry this is really small, I won't go over all this. What has been done? Embedding a culture of acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the land. So I'm so happy to see that Kansas State is doing this with the Faculty Staff Alliance on their webpage today on a daily basis. I really think that's important. There are institutions of higher education like University of Ontario in Canada who has that as a policy that every administrator at every event and function on that campus acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the territory across the board, and we're trying to promote that at the University of New Mexico as well. There are organizations like NASPA, ASH, AERA that also utilize Indigenous land acknowledgement at every place that our conference goes to across the nation and even internationally. Also opening doors for the emergence of Indigenous scholars in education and more recently in higher ed. So how are we going to indigenize those spaces? Because when you go to conferences, or some of you know if you're in a certain profession or career field, there's very rarely a space for Indigenous people or Indigenous scholars specifically. There has to be advocacy from you as an ally or both ways with Indigenous people who are attending the conference. And then in literature, how are we addressing issues where Native students in higher ed are always incorporated with a statistical insignificant or asterisk? So there's been recent literature that has been created and put out there to address and promote Indigenous higher education. And you can see a list of those books. And then also creating symbols that represent us as Indigenous peoples. So there's a logo through the Indigenous Peoples Knowledge Community that has been created that's symbolic of Indigenous peoples. Creating national coalitions for organizations that serve Native students in higher ed. So there's a National Coalition for Advancement of Natives in Higher Education that was created 5 years ago. And so that's another way of building a bridge across the United States and across our organizations that serve Native students. And then advocacy of Native education issues on the Hill to ensure the voice of Native students in K through 20 are remembered. And the needs of our tribal communities are served through advocacy. So we look at the Elementary Secondary Education Act, which is now Every Student Succeeds Act, Esther Martinez Native American Language Preservation Act, among many others. So we have to go to our senators, to our congressmen, to be able to advocate for making sure that these acts are renewed. VAWA, as Dr. Warner was talking about, is important. We need to make sure that we're advocating. So I'm going to come back to my context at UNM, University of New Mexico, which is located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. There are 23 tribal nations in the state of New Mexico, including the 19 Pueblos. There's 3 Apaches, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Fort Sill Apache, who is relocated to Oklahoma, but now has some land in New Mexico, and then also the Navajo Nation. So I want to acknowledge that I, as a person who is not from New Mexico, have had to really, the first couple of years, really get to know the tribes in New Mexico, because I'm not an expert of what New Mexico has, and so I really wanted to take that time to make sure that I was being respectful and learning, and I still don't know everything, and I will never know everything. So I acknowledge that my work is impacting the tribes in New Mexico and the people and the citizens of those tribes. So what needs to be done at UNM? So Dr. Levitt, we were talking about this symbol earlier. The University of New Mexico seal was created, this one specifically was created in 1969, I believe, or approved in 1969. And this has an image of a conquistador on the right-hand side and a frontiersman on the left-hand side. And supposedly the bird on the top is supposed to represent indigenous people, right? We're not human, we're birds. So that is a racist symbol that was a part of the university for over 40 years. And thankfully there has been movements since that time for it to be removed. But over the last 3 to 4 years, the Red Nation, who is a grassroots organization, community organizing organization, and then the Kiva Club, which was founded in 1952 and is a cultural and social action organization and Native student organization on campus, made a movement to abolish the racist still at UNM. It took 2 years, and it also took going to the president's office and having a list of 11 demands, and to film his reaction to delivering that, because he was very racist in his interaction with the students. And so I want to acknowledge that that is a part of the history. But this last year, it was suspended officially as a seal, a presidential seal. So only the president's office can use this. So this is actually used in graduations. It was used on the regalia of students. So Native students were having to use this and wear this when they were graduating and walking across the stage. Why is that important? If you think about mascots and the subconscious racism that might exist on our campuses, we need to acknowledge how that impacts Indigenous student success, but also their own well-being. And so that's also important. And so on the bottom side, de Vargas, who is a conquistador, who also impacted the indigenous peoples in New Mexico, that's a residential hall that's named after de Vargas. So if you actually go to de Vargas, there's Laguna that's right across from it. Laguna is one of the Pueblo nations. And so if Native students are living in de Vargas and they're living next to a hall that's named after maybe their ancestors or somebody they know, just think about the psychological impact that that has on Native students. And then if you look at the 4 murals, they're in the middle, towards the middle, those are found in the library at UNM in the West Wing. And they're actually huge murals. And they represent the colonial settler narrative of what indigenous people and people of color are not even, they don't have faces in these paintings. They don't even have representation. And some of it is very inaccurate representation too. If you look at the one on the top left-hand side, the way that indigenous people are represented is also inaccurate for tribes in New Mexico. But this person, Kenneth Adams, who painted these figures, was commissioned by Zimmerman, who the library is named after. And so now, thankfully, the president, the new president that we have, and the provost are now affording this to the Board of Regents, that there be curtains, because these are historical paintings. They're acknowledged by the New Mexico Historical Society. So they are actually putting forth a recommendation to the regents to put curtains up so that nobody will have to see them anymore unless they have special permission to do so. And then if you look at the bottom right picture, the miracle on the mesa, how many of you guys have looked at Kansas State University historical book, like a historical book that talks about the history of Kansas State University and the founding of it? How many times did you see any narrative about the indigenous peoples that were here before Kansas State was established? Right? So if you look at all of the history books, I looked at all of the history books for UNM, by the way, and all of their narratives about indigenous people were less than a paragraph, right? The acknowledging, even naming the Pueblos. There might have been a name of like Acoma, maybe Isleta named in there, but besides that, the other tribes were left out of that narrative. And the narrative of Miracle on the Mesa says that where Albuquerque and UNM are found, it was barren land and nothing existed before that. But we know, and the indigenous peoples of New Mexico know, that they had been in existence for centuries and that they weren't founded, that they would sit on that land. And we acknowledge at UNM that it sits on Sandia Pueblo land because that's the land that it sits on. So looking at the historical narratives that even our institutions of higher education tells, and they're leaving out indigenous people's history. So what has been done at UNM? I'm just going to talk about this. So on the top left-hand side, you'll see a picture of the students standing up, and those are my doctoral students, as Dr. Redcorn talked about. The Native American Leadership and Education doctoral cohort through the Educational Leadership Program at UNM, we currently have 15 Native American doctoral students going through our Educational Leadership Program. The first cohort, we had 7, the second we had 8. But what's unique about this is that when I was asked and hired at UNM to start a doctoral cohort, they expected me just to start it up and just like use whatever I thought I knew. But instead of doing that, I asked if I could go out into tribal communities to get input from the communities, from educational leaders, tribal education directors, from tribal colleges, from tribal charter schools or native charter schools, to ask them, what does the educational leadership program look like and what are the needs of your community? So again, how is the community guiding our curriculum and our structures? That took a period of 2 years to do, by the way, because of all of those meetings and all of the work getting faculty input as well. And then finally, in fall of 2016, we started our first cohort. And now our first cohort is in their 3rd year of doctoral coursework, and our second cohort is in their 2nd year of coursework. And one of the ways that we can indigenize our programs also is to acknowledge family as a part of the process, right? So how many of us have heard of the helicopter parent, Black Hawk parent as a narrative and a term, right, for higher ed and how we look at our parents and as a part of our children's education, higher ed? So one of the things that I try to do with this is we have an induction process for each cohort. And when they come in, I ask them to invite their families. So with the first year I did this, I wasn't sure what the reception was going to be or what would happen, because I thought, well, I really want to acknowledge and honor the families who are part of the doctoral process with these students. And whenever everybody was in the room, it ended up being about 75 people. So it was grandparents, it was parents, it was brothers and sisters, children, aunts and uncles in the room. That was really pivotal to me because I wanted parents and family members, spouses and wives and partners to know that they were a part of that process, right? So whenever you walk across the stage in 4 years, it's not just your degree, it's your family's degree, it's your community's degree. And so that was really important because as we know, those of us that have been in higher ed as Indigenous people, we don't think about the degree as our own. We think about how we're going to utilize that to advance Indigenous peoples, whether it's in our own communities, in a university setting, or in other places. And so that was really important for me to do that. And now every semester we have a family gathering and a family potluck where we actually invite the families on campus. So their children, they're going to be growing up on campus in the 4 years that their parents are also going through their doctoral degree. And that's really important because a lot of times we don't think thoughtfully about how we're going to make sure that the systems are connected and how we're also making sure we're honoring the backgrounds of the students. On the right-hand side, on the top right-hand side, that's Kiva Club. So I mentioned about them earlier. I'm also the co-advisor for Kiva Club, and I've been their advisor for 5 years. And this year, we've been able to add Nick Estes as a co-advisor, so I was really happy about that. But this is at their Native of Beats event a few years ago. And the reason that I show a picture of them is because they're the ones that were on the front lines for the SIL. They're the ones that were on the front lines for Indigenous Peoples Day. So today, I didn't think I was going to get emotional, but I'm really happy for them because it took 3 years for Indigenous Peoples Day to get passed at the University of New Mexico. And this last June, the Board of Regents finally passed it. And if you think about it, because they actually wanted it to be Indigenous Peoples Day of Resistance and Resilience. And the reason they wanted to do that is to acknowledge our resilience as Indigenous people, but also how we resist against the colonial narratives and structures in UNM, but also within the United States. But they had to compromise because the regents wouldn't pass it in that way, so they had to compromise to Indigenous Peoples Day. So those students were at forums also educating people about why this SIL was racist and the narratives that it was telling just through that symbolism. So I want to acknowledge them because their work is pivotal and they are the ones that were on the ground doing the work. And I really admire them for their strong strength and everything. So I was there supporting them. And they also were the first ones to respond to the Animas River spill. So if anybody has heard of the Animas River spill in Colorado, they were one of the first organizations to respond and to bring money in and to also bring in water to the communities there in Aneth and the Shiprock area. So also they were just one of the first ones to respond to that. And then the bottom left-hand side, that's actually a picture of NACA, Native American Community Academy. It's a Native charter school in Albuquerque. But what this represents is I'm also a part of a collective of Native faculty in our College of Education. I think we're one of the unique colleges of ed in the whole United States because we have 10 Native faculty in the College of Education. That's very rare, right? You think about that. And so one of the things that we wanted to do this 2 years ago was to recreate and reinstitutionalize the Institute for American Indian Education. That was created in the early 2000s, and then we looked at reestablishing that. But what's important about this is that, again, how are we utilizing the community's voice to be a part of the narrative and how we structure and respond to Indigenous education? That's really important because a lot of times we just create these things to fulfill one need that somebody says they need, but we don't go out to all of our communities to hear what's going on in our communities and how can we address some of these needs. And so that's something, this is from a community forum that we had last fall in 2017. We've had 11 community forums across the state of New Mexico in tribal communities, urban communities, to be able to hear from grandparents, parents, superintendents, teachers, higher education, faculty, different people from different communities, language speakers. So there's a couple of forums. There is translation from Navajo to English and back and forth, and also from Mescalero to English. And so we are really, really intentional about trying to include the voice before we establish and implement what IAIE will look like in the next iteration. And then the bottom right-hand side is a picture of Indigenous Education Research Conference. So we established a conference 4 years ago where we wanted to create a conference that was acknowledging and addressing needs around Indigenous education. But not only that, we also wanted to change it up and flip it because a lot of times in the conferences that we attend, right, we're stuck in the institution. We don't go to the communities and see what they're doing around Indigenous education. And so one of our days of that conference, we actually take the participants who are part of it to the communities. So they've gone to NACA, they've gone to Sleda, they've gone to Cochiti, they've gone to Jemez, they've gone to Santa Fe Indian School, they've gone to IAIA, Institute of American Indian Arts. So we were trying to, again, address and make sure that people are visiting these Indigenous education sites and making sure that we're acknowledging the strength that they have and not that we're bringing something to them. They all already have that strength. So what needs to be done? We need to continue to bring an Indigenous voice to areas where Indigenous students, faculty, and staff are often left out. We also need to continue to write and do more research with an Indigenous voice and lens. We need to continue to advocate areas where systemic inequities and miseducation still exist. We need to continue to open doors for other students and scholars to access and impact higher ed with an Indigenous voice and lens. What you can do is you can stand up and create change when you see inequities that exist on campus for Indigenous students, faculty, and staff, and you don't have to be Indigenous to stand up for Indigenous people. And to stand up and create change when you see inequities and social issues within your own tribal or urban communities. Make your education something you can take back to your community. So make your assignments applicable and contextual to an issue or need within your community as something you're passionate about. Create programs and services by giving voice or being a part of the process so that you can benefit, but also so that other students, family, friends, community members can benefit when they come to campus. So I added this in here a couple days ago or yesterday, because I think it's really important when you're doing the work of dismantling the system and the structures, when you're trying to decolonize higher ed or even education in general, there's tips for survival and resistance that we also need to look at doing as those that are doing the work. So we need to build a network of support, right? We need to make sure we have somebody that we can talk to, vent to, somebody that we can make sure that we can rely on. Be forgiving of yourself. I make mistakes every day, and so we always have to be forgiving of ourselves as well. Remember the battle and survival of your ancestors. So today, being here in Kansas, being able to speak on Indigenous Peoples Day, where my ancestors were brought here to die, brought here to be assimilated in Leavenworth, Kansas, that to me is remembering their survival. Love yourself and show it. So again, there's nothing wrong with loving yourself and showing it, because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to be here for our children, our family, our parents, and so forth. And then celebrate every milestone. I always tell my students to celebrate every end of the semester when you finish and those grades are posted, celebrate it, because that's one more semester towards completing your degree. Remember, we are creating the pathway that will lead or impact future generations. And then also, pray and recenter as needed. right? Always remain close to our Creator or whatever form is appropriate for you so that we can remain faithful and know that we have somebody that's looking after us. And then also, I meant to bring it up here. In my bag, I have a medicine bundle and a bag that I carry with me in my backpack all of the time. So take your medicine with you. And it doesn't have to be physical medicine. Medicine is your strength and who you are. So maybe if you're an advocate, if you're somebody who builds good relationships, whatever the medicine is that you've been gifted with, take it with you everywhere you go, because that's really important. I'm sorry. I had a graphic up here, but you can't see it. It was from Nikita Gill, and it talked about being an ancestor and knowing that we don't need to shrink for others because of that. So thank you all for listening and for being a part of this discussion.
We have 10 minutes for question and answer, so feel free to raise your hand and just restate the question. The microphone comes up.
Dr. Levitt.
Well, first, thank you so much. This is amazing. And just to acknowledge that I consider myself one of your mentees because I was a graduate student when you were invited to the club and doing a lot of activism with them. And you were doing a lot of this under a particularly racist president of the university while you were not tenured yet. And so you ran a whole lot of risks to advocate for students and did such an amazing job. And I think that your vulnerability in that position needs to be acknowledged as some of the courage and amazing advocacy that was involved in that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt.
So then second, I had a quick question. Well, now I feel bad that
No, that's all right. Check, check.
So for those of you who didn't hear, I just said how amazing it was that all of that advocacy and work was done during an untenured period, and that is kind of amazing, the kind of courage and commitment to do that when one's job is particularly vulnerable. So that I wanted to just project that one more time because my high femme Barbie voice didn't really do that to the back row. So then second, as an alumni of University of New Mexico and being involved in some of the organizing there, I know that one of the other things that has been a big problem has been the culture of anti-Indianism on campus, and that we had a huge dorm complex called the Redondo Dorm, which was named after Bosque Redondo, which was the internment camp that 9,500 Navajo people and 500 Mescalero Apache people were interned at the end of the Long Walk. And so to have a dorm room named after a concentration camp is a problem, but B, having it be something that Native students are then housed in during their 4 years at the university, and then naturalized and celebrated through that kind of campus acknowledgement is a huge problem. And I was wondering kind of where that's gone and how that's being talked about, if you had any kind of update on that.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt. Yes, so I think we're taking it one step at a time. So I was reminding Kiva Club last Friday before their meeting that they had 11 listed demands, and so far they've had 4 of their demands of the 11 met, which is really awesome. And I think sometimes it seems so slow because institutions, it takes forever for change to happen. And so I think a part of the SEAL committee is that we can also look at the space, because there is not a space policy on how you name buildings. It's only when you name buildings after a person, not naming buildings after something, a historical event, or a group of people. So I don't even think that Laguna or I'm trying to think, I think there's Pima, there's other tribal nations I don't think were even asked for permission to being named after. So we need to revisit all of these buildings, because I think the murals are one thing, the sill is another, but then go back to looking at the naming. So thank you for bringing that, because we definitely need, and that's on the list. And I also chair the Diversity Council for UNM, and so I'm also going to put that on our priority to look at these list of demands too, because it's not just the responsibility of Kiva Club. And that's something that we need to make sure that our students aren't the ones that are having to do all of the advocacy and the footwork. As administrators, as faculty, as staff, we need to stand with them as well whenever they ask for a change or a need for on campus.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much for this presentation and your talk. It's incredibly inspiring. And as a professor of a number of students who are not Indigenous identified, self-identified, enrolled, etc., I often ask them to engage in Indigenous perspective in a respectful way. And oftentimes I hear, but I'm not Indigenous, what do I do? How do I do that? How do I educate myself? So on and so forth. I know what I say to them, but I wonder if you would share what you would say to those students.
I think, so I also teach an Intro to Native, or I haven't taught it for a little bit, but Intro to Native American Studies class, where one of their assignments is they have to go to an Indigenous event on campus and an Indigenous event off campus. So I try to get them to go off campus to see and be a part of Indigenous community, because it's totally different in both places, right? So one of the things that I ask them to do is to be observers and not necessarily engagers yet, because we need to observe our environment. And also, again, like you said, be respectful. So they're observing what they're seeing, what they're watching, and what the strengths are, how it impacted them. And so also that self-reflection is really important, especially as a non-Indigenous person. Because I think sometimes we just want to engage instead of actually reflecting. And I heard this term a couple weeks, or I think it was last week, about deep listening. We know a lot about deep listening, like instead of like trying to figure out like how am I going to respond to your question, I need to listen to what you're asking and what you're saying and then go back and think about it, right? So I think that's important to think about too.
Are there any other questions?
Maybe kind of along those lines, you pointed out the Ivy Leagues, but I noticed that you skipped over, we are a land grant, and we have a lot to acknowledge. How do we reflect on that?
Well, I also worked at Oklahoma State University, which is a land grant institution as well in Oklahoma. And I think holding yourself accountable to how are you engaging with the tribal communities here in Kansas? How are we responding to their needs? So UNM is a Research One institution, but all of the things that we're doing with community, with the Institute for American Indian Education, IERC, like those are things to me that a land grant institution should be doing and being responsive to the needs of the community. So how are we fulfilling the needs and how are we addressing that and how are we building partnerships and long-standing relationships with those communities, not a one-time visit, not a one-time thing, but something that's going to be sustainable over generations. I think that would be really important.
Any other questions?
Sorry, me again. This question is from the perspective of faculty administration and thinking about things. I'm an assistant professor, not yet tenured, and thinking about things like our contracts, the weight that's given to research versus service and community, particularly when your work touches on issues that are important to Indian country and Indian communities. What would you say to faculty hoping to sort of incorporate that in a different way in their work? And this can be for future faculty members who are students now. And what would you say to administrators who are making the rules to a certain extent around these contracts and how these are read and understood?
Yeah, so promotion and tenure, for those of you who may not be familiar with that, I didn't understand it until I became a faculty member, actually. So it's a 6-year process where you actually are under evaluation every single year, and they can basically fire you at any point if they want to. And then once you're tenured and you're associate professor, you have more sustainability, although there is still some ways that you can probably be removed too. but there are guidelines for promotion and tenure where you have to be excellent in teaching and service, or teaching and research, and then service sometimes is counted. But one of the things that UNM and our College of Ed has done is we revisited what the definition of excellence means. And so for research and scholarship, we acknowledge that work with tribal communities is a part of being excellent. So acknowledging that community-based participatory research is a part of being excellent. So I think it's redefining how you identify and define excellence in your department and your college. But the other part of it that probably isn't something that I would advise somebody, but I do think it's important because I reiterate this all the time, is if I'm not comfortable being myself in my position, then I don't need to be there. And one of the things is if the academy is not going to accept me for who I am and what I'm advocating for, then maybe I need to leave that space, or I need to advocate for change in that place. And so that's something that I've been very, try to be authentic to who I am when I came into the institution, and try to make sure I was communicating that about what I thought and what I considered as being authentic as an Indigenous scholar, an Indigenous faculty member. But I think the other thing is finding people who are in the same line of doing the same work that you're doing. Having those people as a support system is really important, but also making sure that we're redefining how we look at Indigenous scholarship. And it's not just service, it's also scholarship, because a lot of our work, like the work I did with NIEA and other organizations, NIYC, the National Indian Youth Council, that was also considered scholarship because that's important for us to continue to progress as Indigenous peoples here in the United States. I hope I answered your question.
I just wanted to thank Dr. Menthorn for coming here. If everybody could join me in giving her a round of applause. I wanted to give her this cedar box and some tobacco, and just thank you for everything. All right. So, from what I understand, lunch isn't quite ready, but it is on its way, and it will be here shortly. And we do have an extended break here. So, just for people.